do you believe that radio is keeping up with the current times, and why is this?
Um, yes, I think I do. I mean, radio is kind of like a format that I think fundamentally will probably always exist because there's always kind of a requirement for that. Because radio is a medium which we find a lot of the time it's a passive listen. Most people listen to the radio not necessarily because they're listening, but to have something on in the background. Like we saw that during COVID, all of that, people saw radio as more something to keep you company. Whereas kind of like other mediums, you have to engage with it. Whereas
Yeah.
radio, you were engaging with it, but in a slightly less dominating way, I think. So I think it'll always fundamentally exist, but obviously we have to kind of change our tack and we have to be better with social media, and make sure our content's going onto YouTube and kind of just things like that to make sure that you have to push your content slightly further afield than I think you used to have to.
All right, that's perfect. So, next question. What are the newest strategies that you're putting forward to and being used to keep radio relevant to a new and younger audience? Why has this been like added?
I mean, in terms of radio itself, I, it fundamentally hasn't changed a huge amount. It is still someone speaking into a mic and people listening, but I think what you have to take into account is the talent you have. Is it still reaching the audience you want? Are we talking about the relevant things? Are we referencing other media on the radio? Are we referencing TikTokers, that kind of thing? And again, just making sure that our content goes out on Instagram, TikTok, all of that, and that you're pushing things from an alternative perspective that pushes kind of listener, well, pushes people who are watching like our content on TikTok to back to the radio. Um, whether that be through like exclusive online content or stuff that we filmed in the studio.
Yeah. Well, you've basically just mentioned this next question before, but it's more on like how is radio changing to keep up with the technical and digital era, which you did just say about TikTok and Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, my job at the moment is content AP at One Extra, so that is making social content mainly for Nadia's show.
Mm.
Um, so I mean, a lot of what we do there is if we you kind of pick the bits you want to film from each show, and if there isn't anything to film, you don't force it. But if you have a guest in, then you make sure that you are filming it and that you, as much as it's going out for radio, that you're taking into account that it is a visualized piece of work as well, and that it will exist on its own in online. And that is probably going to be the space where some people see it and never listen back to it on sounds or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, do you think radio is changing fast enough to keep up with the digital times?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, as I say, radio is a slightly interesting medium. I think people always say it's going to die. People said it was going to die when they invented the TV. People said it was going to die when they invented the DVD. People said it was going to die when they invented the podcast. It's always going to have a space. It's just whether or not certain stations or certain mediums will exist. I mean, it, the breakfast shows are still the main crux of
Yeah.
any radio station, but with changing work habits and all of that, will that be the same in 10, 15 years?
Well, yeah.
Probably, but I mean, will there be a greater spread across the day? Probably. Will kind of mid-morning shows become more um content, well, no, listener heavy? Probably, because I think people will be getting up later, or Wednesdays and Thursdays someone works from home, so they don't necessarily need to tune in at 7 a.m. anymore. So it's just things like that. It's changing society will have an impact on the way listeners interact with us.
Right. So I'm guessing you're saying here that radio is staying relevant, right, at this current moment in time.
It's staying relevant. um yeah.
Well, what do you think like in the next 10 years radio will have to do to change to keep up?
I
Because
mean,
we see
I
that like the past 10 years, I mean,
yeah,
much
I
everything has.
mean, I think the most important thing is kind of like pre-recorded content. So as much as radio is live, I think the way people interact with media nowadays, a lot of it is, downloading and podcasts and things like that. And I think as much as it is very important to obviously maintain a linear kind of like Radio 1 station, um, radio station, that you are expanding into podcasts and you have other side projects for your presenters and they are being pushed in other places. Um, and it's making sure that the content you're putting out there isn't solely there to exist on the radio, and that people who don't listen to the radio all the time are still aware of what your brand is and what your brand does.
Yeah.
I think in particular people like Radio 2 do it very well. I think Radio 1 does it very well. I think One Extra does it well, and I mean Capital are very good at it. And it's about making that brand clear enough that yes, it's a radio station, but we do other things.
Well, you've mentioned podcasts quite a bit. So do you ever
Yeah.
think podcasts will take over in popularity? Why do you think this?
I think they are. I think they have reached peak popularity, if I'm honest. I don't yeah, it's about kind of
Now connected to Heather.
podcasts have kind of reached their, I think, maximum kind of not growth. Obviously, podcasts will grow and people will listen, but I think in terms of it being such a big deal over the last 10 years, like podcast, everyone will have a podcast. We're going to begin to plateau now. And I think radio and podcast can exist simultaneously.
Yeah. All right. So because you just mentioned radio and podcasts kind of like going alongside each
Better?
other. Yeah, that's better. You've just mentioned radio and podcasts going alongside each other a bit.
Yeah.
Like there. And basically, well, a lot of radio shows are having like side podcasts. For example, Radio 1's breakfast show has Greg James's All Day Breakfast, which is on Sounds.
Yeah.
Do you think this is the way forward in the future?
I think they're useful. I think it allows people to, particularly for people who are in cities, which is a large percentage of like our younger demographic who don't necessarily drive anywhere. They'll get on a bus and they'll be on their phones instead. It's useful in that sense that they can download something and listen to Greg for, they listen to the whole show in what, half an hour, I think it is.
I think it is.
Maybe even less. And you can consume a whole breakfast show in, minutes rather than hours.
Yeah.
And I mean, I always thought something that was quite an interesting stat when Scott and Chris were on Radio 1, they were the most downloaded show on Sounds. And so a lot of people use Scott and Chris as their drive show.
In what ways do you think radio can continue to compete with podcasts in the future?
The thing is, I don't even think radio and podcast need to compete. I think they kind of, as I say, exist side by side. They have they're different mediums. I don't. I think. I think that regardless of podcasts existing, radio listenership would go down anyway, just because of the way people consume stuff. Not everyone drives anymore. Most people listen to stuff through their phones. I would say podcasts' main competitor is people like Spotify and Apple Music, which I guess are also our competitors. But I think they can exist side by side. But I do think in terms of radio, we as we are doing already, we need to kind of create our own podcast alongside of that, and we need to have kind of like exclusive podcasts with content that isn't necessarily on air already, which again, like Radio 1 are doing with kind of Nick and Annie at the moment and things like that. It pushes the brand without necessarily having to have the listener tune into Radio 1. And I think if you can have a solid listenership that aren't actually tuning into the radio, it will maintain that station regardless of listenership. And I think in the future there'll be a lot less emphasis on things like radars, more emphasis on downloads and like activations on smart speakers and things like that. And I think the way we measure a radio station's success will be less about we have 6 million listeners a week or whatever, and it'll be more about this is the most downloaded podcast and all of that.
Yeah. All right. Well, last question. Altogether, to you, what makes a good radio show?
A presenter who makes the audience feel like they're their mate I think is the most important thing. Radio presenters are different to any other kind of presenter in the sense that they are bringing the listeners into their world, and they are less celebrity focused, even though obviously you have celebrity DJs. Greg James is a celebrity in a sense, but the way that you interact with the audience is a lot more, it's closer. You have direct interaction, you can text, and it's TV you're a lot more separated. You don't think you're ever going to kind of meet Holly Willoughby, and you don't think she is most people kind of will, if you really are loving, think of that presenter as your friend. Scott and Chris were particularly good at it. Greg is very good at it. Jordan's very good. And just a very solid production team. If your production team around you know what they're doing, then you're away, because the production team are the people who make it at the end of the day. We don't get paid as much, but we are the people who come up with the ideas and put everything into action. And if you have a solid team behind the show, you can make anything happen realistically.
Well, that's perfect. Thank you.